footage you're about to see should appear perceptually accurate on a decently well-calibrated HDR TV screen. Which is to say that if you looked at the real scene and at the display side by side like this, they would appear roughly indistinguishable to you. At least within the range of brightness and color that a screen can physically produce. This video is mainly intended for you to enjoy with the audio off. Mute my voice, put on some music that you enjoy, and let yourself be immersed in a day in this beautiful, historical, Central European city. Maybe you have been to Vienna a long time ago and want to reminisce. Maybe you've never been and would like to experience somewhere new and lose yourself in it for a while. Or perhaps you even live here and want to see how a tourist captured it over the course of a day of sightseeing. If you do not want to tune out, however, or cannot switch to a different audio track, you're welcome to join me in this low-stakes commentary instead. I'm going to talk about the case for and against HDR, color grading, the intent behind this video, and the how and the why of me making this video that you're watching to try and be as perceptually accurate as possible. Now, it might skew a little technical, but we have a lot of time. It's about half an hour long, so I'm not going to rush through it. Let's say you're like me and you've finally decided to upgrade from not having a TV to getting a nice big modern OLED. It's got 4K high resolution, sure, and it's also HDR. But what do you do with that? What does that even mean for you as a consumer of media? And what kind of HDR content can you or should you watch to make the most of your fancy new TV? YouTube supports HDR, and with a modern smart TV is probably the obvious first stop. You can search for HDR videos and you'll get one or two really great results. I really want to shout out in particular the 2020 LG OLED test video, the black. It's the one with the honey dipping stick and all the really crisp highlights on the honey and other fluids against like a really deep dark background. It's a fantastic showcase for a modern set. I fire it up anytime I want to like show what actual HDR is to someone. And it really shows off what this panel that you've spent anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand of your favorite local currency can do. There are also a handful of other channels worth finding. Jacob and Katie Schwartz's for one. They've got like shorter travel pieces that are beautifully mastered for HDR. And then there's the rest of it. It's a sea of generic 8K and 4K channels. They all have slightly different names, but pretty much the same branding, the same mostly AI-generated thumbnails, and kind of the same disappointing way of showing their HDR. Almost all of these channels also advertise their videos as Dolby Vision, which YouTube does not support Dolby Vision, so to my understanding it's an entirely meaningless label in this context. And while the footage underneath is often perfectly pretty B-roll, it's like colourful animals, sweeping landscapes, drone shots, sunrises, it kind of tends to look pretty bad in HDR. I strongly suspect it's a classic case of somebody just plugging a content gap by reusing what I assume is probably commercially available, well shot but not purpose shot footage, which consumers probably won't pick up on. A lot of that material was never shot for high dynamic range to begin with, so when it's stretched to fill an HDR container, you get highlight clipping, banding, and the saturation is just cranked up beyond what the data can support. And it just ends up looking like that kind of cheap electronics shop window vibe. It's bright for the sake of being bright. It's garish and overcooked, And if you don't really know what HDR is and what it's meant to be, you might look at it and go, God, if this is what HDR is, why did I pay so much money for this junk? So the reason I wanted to make this video is that for Christmas I was gifted a record player. And I found that what pairs really well with putting a vinyl on is having some pleasant ambient video playing on mute in the living room TV while the music plays. And I couldn't really find much out there that was both long form and properly prepared for HDR, even though it's not especially difficult content to make. Now, I love taking photos and videos, and I'm a professional nerd for light and color science, so I thought I'd take a stab at it myself, and here we are. I'm 9 of 9, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Thanks for sticking with this video so far. I'm a video game developer by trade, a technical artist, so HDR has been a source of both frustration and fascination for me for about 11 years now. I was first briefed on it at the SIGGRAPH 2015 conference, and ever since then it has been, I think, a technology slightly struggling both to grow into itself and to deliver on what it promises, while also still sort of casting about for something that people might actually want to use it for. Like higher resolution and higher frame rate, it's a bit hard to show it off if you're not already bought in and don't have the hardware. But unlike higher resolution, it's kind of difficult to even describe what it is, let alone why you should care about it. So, well, let me try. All of the advances in display technology that I can think of are advances in getting screens to come closer and closer to replicating reality, to creating a window to the world, one that can, in principle, fool your eye into seeing something that isn't there as if it were. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal sense. The perfect screen, I think, would be, by this measure, one that looks indistinguishable from a real window. HDR isn't a single technical advance so much as a standard designed to take advantage of multiple current and near-future display improvements. Brighter LED and mini LED backlights let a TV push far more light than older sets ever could, and narrowband emitters like quantum dots give us much more intense and saturated colors. OLEDs, they can get pretty bright too, but what they really bring to the table is the other end of the scale. They switch all the way off, and so you get really pure blacks, much deeper shadows, far higher contrast ratios than anything we've had before. And here's the thing, this might not sound like a big deal. So why should you care about it? Well, if you've ever used an old camera, like a 90s little VHS camera or like an old iPhone or whatever, something with a really crappy narrow dynamic range, you might know how painful it is to expose a room with windows. Outdoor light is absurdly bright, and indoor light is orders of magnitude darker. Yet in real life, we don't really have that much of a problem looking out of a window or at a sunset, and we can still see plenty of detail around that window and around that sunset in the shadows. But in a video, you end up having to make a choice. You either expose for the shadows or you expose for the light. You have to pick the dark or the bright. And that's a limitation that we've had as far back as we've been shooting film. And it has plenty of creative solutions. You can tape neutral density gels, basically turn the glass into tinted windows, or you can bring in lots of lights and lift up the intensity of your interior lighting. You know, low-tech solution, you can just wait and shoot at a time of day when the sky is less bright. And you can shoot a low contrast film or reduce the contrast in post and flatten your image, and it will look a little bit more grey and lifeless, but you will see a bit more detail in the brights and the shadows. But if you had a display that is capable of outputting very bright colours, you just wouldn't have to do any of that. You could simply show the viewer the natural contrast between the interior and the exterior, like how it would look if they were really there. The inside and the outside would both be visible at once, the way they are to the eye of the observer. The other part of HDR, the wider gamut part, is about being able to render purer, more saturated colors than a normal screen can manage. And that means you can also occasionally show lasers and LEDs and certain flowers which fall outside of the color gamut of the standard dynamic range. But honestly, I think that's a far more niche application. Content outside of that standard dynamic range color gamut is vanishingly rare, though I suppose it was until LED lighting became more common. For most people, though, the big TV benchmark is movies, and movies, I think, are rarely interested in pushing the technical envelope. Film is a format with relatively strict conventions, and trying to push back on them is usually met with resistance, both from filmmakers and audiences. Think of high frame rate cinema, which tends to get dismissed as uncinematic, or 3D, which has widely split opinions. Creating a window to the world is a task that cinema is mostly uninterested in, and I think that's for a good reason. A cinematographer is ultimately in the business of telling a story by controlling your attention. Contrast and color are precise tools with well-established conventions attached. If a shot were to put a bright window behind the actor, blazing many times brighter than their face, your eye would be drawn to the bright light and the bright colors outside of that window instead of the performance. It would certainly be technically impressive, but you would spend your entire time watching the park outside the window, and the director of photography wants your eyes on the actor, not being distracted by the scenery. So the window detail works against the intentions of the cinematographer unless they have specifically shot to account for that. And of course, HDR can be and has been used to great effect for cinematic storytelling. Fincher's Mank from 2020 is a really good example, I think, but I also think it's not a coincidence that the film trades color for HDR. It's shot fully in black and white. It takes color off the table entirely, and that, I think, gives the filmmakers more leeway to then focus on the brightness and the contrast of the high dynamic range, and so they don't have to compete for information with color for things that will distract you, simplifying that problem for themselves. And if you ever want to go deeper on how filmmakers think about this, this is one to bookmark for after this video if you want to learn more. Steve Yedlin's presentations on his site yedlin.net are the best I know. Yedlin is a cinematographer who's worked with Rian Johnson, so movies like Looper, The Last Jedi, the Knives Out films. He has a brilliantly technical approach to cinematic color science. He's a great way to get into the deeper side of things, film emulation, HDR for grading, film stock gauges, and so on. He's hugely inspiring to me in my work, and his talk on HDR in particular gets into its place in film editing and where it has perhaps been oversold to consumers and filmmakers. I'd expect this idea, presenting the world as it is, to be far more exciting to documentarians. And it is, but documentarians are storytellers too, and as storytellers they still need to steer your eye to guide you from beat to beat. So HDR becomes for them as well another thing to be a little wary of. Games, though, are the other big use case for HDR, and there the picture gets more interesting. Under the hood, games have been modelling high dynamic range lighting since Half-Life 2's The Lost Coast add-on. So we do simulate often close to real-world light values, and therefore we do have the data to work with. And then we use a tone mapping function similar to how film or other video processors flattens down the full dynamic range of real life to a typical screen's luminance range. HDR display tech lets us unroll more of the luminance range of the virtual scene. The blinding sun as you step out of a cave, the muzzle flash of a gun, or the hyper-saturated, colourful laser fire, that sort of thing. If you're looking to get immersed in a world, it can be wonderfully effective. I've played a lot of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 in HDR, and there's something to me really cozy and wonderful about seeing a virtual torch on your screen being so bright that it casts real shadows across the room, and you can see those shadows move and flicker as the torchlight moves about. But games also want to control your attention. Games are often an overwhelming cacophony of information, and surfacing important information to the player is really difficult. As a designer or an artist, you're always thinking about how to direct the player's eye to where it needs to be. And unlike in film, you're also working with player agency. So often you can't even frame the shot, you can't move the camera to curate what it's seeing. Especially not in VR, where if you do that, the player will vomit everywhere. This means that HDR luminance headroom also acts on attention, and I think even in games we can see a bit of tension here. Picture a sci-fi game, and it's got little Blinkenlichten everywhere, little bright saturated LEDs all over the decor. In HDR, if you render them realistically, they start to pull your eye in a way nothing in the standard range will. So you assume those bright lights must be something important and interactable, and then you realize they're not. The interactable things are the ones marked with yellow paint, which would have been the obvious thing jumping out at you if these little lights weren't suddenly glowing and so bright. It's not an intractable problem, but it relies on either visual design that takes HDR into account, or the player rewiring their own expectations, learning that while bright colours usually signal importance, the really bright ones, those are just set dressing. That's the light bulbs, the sci-fi buttons, the screens, and you need to filter those out in the same way that in real life you don't directly stare at actual light bulbs and street lamps and think they're important. And then there's a simpler constraint as well, the same one that held back other technology like 3D, is that even now, the proportion of any audience who actually have HDR displays, let alone good ones set to the right mode, is fairly small. And if you build your media to lean on dynamic range as an essential storytelling tool, rather than a bit of spectacle, you're making a worse experience for most of the people watching who will not get that side of your content. Which is why I think it's content like this, the video you're watching right now, not really trying to tell a story, but something closer to a kind of ambient installation, is maybe where HDR can thrive and show what it does well. It's unburdened by any need to steer your eye. It hands a little agency back to you. You can look anywhere you like in the scene. Absorb it, immerse yourself, let yourself be transported. Feel a sense of actually being there. It's a narrow niche, but a cozy niche, I think. And it's a niche I keep wishing had a little more to it. I really do wish there was more content like this, or at the very least that this kind of media was easier to find. I shoot a lot of photography and a lot of video, and I was inspired in a lot of this journey by Stevie Edlin's display prep demo, which is why I also love working with film emulation software to make footage that feels timeless and cinematic and analog rather than crisp and clean and digital. If that's your kind of thing too, you might want to stick around and subscribe. I am putting together a much more in-depth video about my process, how I shoot and edit aimed at beginner photographers, which I'll upload here in the next few weeks once I've finished writing and shooting it. But this video specifically was a really fun experiment. Fun for me, anyway, I hope also fun for you, in taking the completely opposite approach. There's no film emulation here, no stylization, no filmmaker opinion whatsoever. If you remember the cameo at the very start, my lovely fiancée sitting in front of an HDR display showing a double of herself, that's the promise of this video. If you play it back on a well-calibrated, properly set up screen, you should see almost precisely the image you'd have seen standing in Vienna yourself in late May. And I'll give just a couple of caveats to that. The first is that I have remapped the exposure. I've scaled the brightness down to luminance values that consumer TV can actually produce without melting plastic. Generally speaking, images don't change much when the brightness changes. If you had a photograph, it would look like the same photograph whether you looked at it in the sunlight or indoors. And performing this kind of image matching isn't quite as difficult as it might sound, though it's maybe also a little harder than it needs to be. A true colorimetric match relies on the whole chain behaving itself. The camera's color science, the wide gamut intermediate that the footage is carried in, the Rec 2020 container and its transfer function, and then this display's own calibration. All of it needs to be doing the right thing and compensating for its own particularities. So it's easy in the sense that this chain is built to be colorimetric by default. Every link in it was engineered to carry color faithfully, for decades in some cases. So my job mostly is to stay out of the way, to get the white point right, to avoid clipping highlights when I record the video, handling the color spaces properly, that sort of thing. And that's essentially enough. Where it gets a little bit difficult is where the technology hasn't quite caught up and there are still gaps. For example, the spectral response of the camera's photosites isn't exactly the same as the spectral output of the TV's OLED pixels. So there's a bit of a massaging there. The reds, greens and blues of the camera captures aren't the same as the red, greens and blues of the TV. And so when I was preparing the color matching demo at the start, I found that the result was very, very close with no corrections at all. But it looked just a little bit off to my eyes, and it looked a little bit off to the camera, and it looked a little bit off on my phone camera, and it was a slightly different difference on all three of them. And it was pretty easy to subtly nudge the color balance, the proportion of red, green and blue, to get a perfect match on the camera or in my eyes or on my phone, but I couldn't really get all three to be exactly identical at the same time. And I also chose in setting this up to not correct for white balance. I shot at 6500K daylight, which is the same neutral white point the Rec 2020 standard is built around. So barring any setting on your display that shifts its color temperature, like my screen's cinema mode for some reason, as I mentioned, the colors should land close to how they were captured, which means that as the day wears on and the sun begins to set, you'll see bluer shadows and stronger color casts. And this should balance pleasantly with what you'd see outdoors outside of your window if you played this video at the same time of day. But because of this, the video might look a little strange if you're watching it in a room with, say, cool daylight white overhead lights. It'll have a distinct color cast the same way that after an evening indoors under artificial light, if you look out of the window, everything outside will seem to have gone blue. But in a darker room or with some kind of ambilight setup that matches your surroundings to the same color as the screen, I find it contributes to a really cozy and magical experience. If you're watching this on a new TV and haven't been through the picture settings yet, now might be a good time to think about it. Displays usually default to performing their own interpretations on top of the HDR content you're already watching, and there's a good reason for some of it. A key difference between SDR and HDR as signal standards is that SDR only ever specified a relative brightness. You set how bright you want your screen to be, and that screen could be a Times Square billboard drawing kilowatts of power, and the signal just says how much darker than that maximum each part of the image should be. HDR is a little bit interesting that way because it dictates the brightness and the chromaticity of each pixel in real-world terms. It specifies how bright your screen should be in absolute units. Except, and this is worth a quick tangent, this is true of the PQ-based formats that most consumer HDR uses, like HDR10 and Dolby Vision, but not of HLG, the broadcast standard, which actually stays relative like SDR because it is designed to be backwards compatible with the SDR gamma curve. So that is its own little extra layer of confusion when people talk about HDR. At any rate, it has no inherent awareness of whether you're watching in a pitch dark room or at an outdoor barbecue. It doesn't have any real notion of user settings. That only really arrives with much later ambient aware editions like Dolby Vision IQ and now Dolby Vision 2, none of which are on YouTube. And it can also ask your display to produce lights and colors that are far brighter and more saturated than the TV is physically capable of, because the signal itself accounts for future displays that can do things that modern displays can't. So in all of these cases, it's the TV's job to decide what to do, and therefore manufacturers enable some sensible defaults, nudging the image brighter in case you're watching in a bright room, adding their own tone mapping in case the signal is brighter than what the TV can display, even shifting the color temperature like my panel's cinema mode for some reason. Some of these you might actually want, but technically they all chip away at color accuracy. So if you're interested in recreating something like this color matching experiment, it's worth looking up a guide to turning these features off for your particular model to get back to a clean HDR signal. And if you care about authorial intent, again, that is how you would get the closest to how the filmmaker or game developer wanted you to see this content. I want to be clear, by the way, that none of what I'm doing here is a novel concept. This colorimetric approach is the same premise behind LED volumes used in filmmaking, where real sets are blended seamlessly with virtual ones. It's how installation art displays are set up, and this kind of unopinionated color reproduction I think is pretty routine in a lot of broadcast as well. But it's just not very popular. And I haven't come across colorist YouTubers, your Cullen Kellys, or Kaskazis, Darren Mostons, any of them covering how to render out relative or absolute colorimetric video, probably because, for the most part, this is the baseline that you get from a formal ground-up education rather than from YouTube snippets. And it's not really a how-to that anybody would really ask for. But I think if you're an aspiring colorist or filmmaker and this is all new to you, maybe it's a worthwhile experiment, certainly for anyone who's serious about color science, to do it yourself, to understand how and why it works, to prove to yourself that you understand this pipeline. And as I mentioned, you need to work around the hardware limitations and turn off some of the clever things your TV does on top of the HDR signal. But in principle, the standards are all there to support you in this, and it's useful to understand that. It's maybe interesting also to hammer home why I'm so confident that this is close to reality, even though I can't exactly go back to Vienna and stand in Museumsplatz with a TV and a trolley and check them both side by side. And it isn't really down to the color checker. I can use a color checker like the one you saw at the start to validate and to nudge closer to the truth. But the key reason we know what it actually looked like is that the camera is an extraordinarily well-calibrated data collection device. We know the spectral responses of the Nikon Z8 sensor, the camera that I used to shoot this, and we know from the raw footage from that data stream how those photosites on the sensor were activated when shooting. We know the exposure, the aperture, the sensitivity we shot at. We can also approximate the transmissive values of the lens that I used. or if you're using a cinema lens, you will have an exact t-stop value. In other words, how much light was absorbed or scattered in the optics, and therefore we're losing from the light that entered the front of the lens. Working backwards from all that, we don't get an exact count of photons and wavelengths, but we do get a broad bucket. We know what kind of light must have hit the sensor for us to have captured what we did, and then we can work backwards from there to make your TV produce the same kind of light. Ultimately, the basic problem of fitting reality inside a screen runs into some fundamental physical hardware limitations. Spectral responses, yes, but, as I've also mentioned, how high the brightness can go. I've reproduced the colours faithfully here, that's the colorimetric part. The brightness, though, I've had to scale down to fit your screen, which makes it relative colorimetric. That matte shot at the very start with my fiancée beside her double is the rare case where the scene was dim enough that even the brightness is real and I don't need to scale it at all. So that shot specifically is absolute colorimetric. Earlier, I also said that an image stays much the same under different brightnesses. That's broadly true, but again, that comes with some subtle caveats. There is a family of perceptual effects to do with how the brightness of an image and of its surroundings changes the way we perceive color within it. I can't control the room you're watching this in, but I can compensate for a couple of the basic effects, the Hunt effect and the Stevens effect, which broadly say that brighter light tends to increase our perception of color saturation and contrast. These come out of a field called color appearance modeling, and I am using a model called CIE CAM16 specifically, which lets me put an actual number on how much colorfulness I lose by dimming a scene down from its real-world value, and I can add back close to exactly that much instead of eyeballing it. It's subtle, but it is something that I actively correct for here. And I can do this, again, because we have the data on how these scenes were shot. We can make a reasonable estimate of the measured real-world brightness, and we know the brightness that we're displaying them at on the TV, so we know the difference, the ratio between those two. And therefore we can compensate for how much more saturated and contrasty a brightly lit daylight scene like this would have looked in real life. Now, this is all really cool, I think, if you're a color science nerd like me, but also I definitely wouldn't do this to everything. Would I grade all or even most of my videos in this way? No, not even close. I love the storytelling side of it, imparting character, tweaking aesthetics, playing with film emulation and analog vibes like I mentioned before. In fact, the very next day after this video, I was shooting my friend's wedding. I graded that one in a completely different way. I still did it in HDR, but with a much lighter touch on the HDR peaks. I used an Ektachrome film emulation for more of a timeless cinematic kind of vibe to it. The kind of grade that's meant to heighten the glamour and bring a tear to the eye of the bride and groom and half their relatives. An unopinionated colorimetric grade like this one would have lost all of that. My one regret, by the way, is because I knew that I was going to be shooting the wedding after this day. I knew I wouldn't have enough room left on my 1 terabyte card to shoot half an hour of this 8K footage at 60 frames per second. So I shot this at 30 and I had to interpolate the motion up to 60, which is deeply upsetting to me given what I'm trying to do here, but oh well, there's always next time. That about wraps us up for this video, I think. So thank you for coming this far. I do really wish we had more videos like this. Just something chill that you can put on your big HDR screen while you put a record on, sit back and watch the world go by from your virtual porch. Thank you for watching, and if you've got any more videos like this one that you'd like to recommend, please drop them in the comments. I really desperately need suggestions for my record listening playlist. I'll see you next time.